This podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not intended to replace therapeutic services of any kind. Please refer to the list of references provided if you need support.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Sessions with Sara Cate and Ashley. I'm Ashley.
I'm Sara Cate.
We're going to have a discussion today about anger and rage, the differences, what it feels like. I'm really excited to have Sara Cate also walk us through an example of an exercise that might be helpful for you. So I think, I recently had a client talk about how she was really working on not reacting when she felt so angry. She kind of described it as like she felt like she goes from 0 to 100 and she's filled with anger, but then doesn't know what to do with it. And one of the things that might happen is then we get into situations, maybe you say things that you wish you would have just kept to yourself. You do things that you maybe wish you didn't. And that can create some extra chaos in our life. And I think it's really awesome and brave and hard when we can look at ourselves and say like, yeah, I don't like the way I react when I feel this emotion. Not that the emotion is bad, but that I don't like how I respond to when this happens inside of my body. And I want a healthier way for me to move through it. And so that's why we're here having this conversation, because we haven't had really a conversation about.
We've dipped our toes in at different points, but it's never been a really devoted, we had one devoted to shame.
Yeah.
And we haven't really devoted one to anger, and it's kind of mismanaged companion rage.
Yeah. So maybe, just to kind of have a moment with yourself and kind of think about, as you grew up, how were you allowed to express anger? We're going to get into difference between anger and rage, but just whichever one you want to think about right now, just kind of think about that as, were you allowed, did you have space to express anger? Or if you were angry, how would that come out? Right? I think we know, and we've all probably seen examples of people who just retreat and cry or go in their room, slam the door, and just want to be left alone. I think we've seen examples of people who throw tantrum, legit, what you would consider a tantrum, and kick their feet on the ground or scream, those kinds of things. And so kind of think back and just give yourself a moment to see where you sit with this. And the people around you, in your household, how did they express their anger? This isn't a episode on, the differences between being male and female. But when we look back on how this has presented in our life, I don't know that we can move forward without acknowledging the suppression of anger. And yes, the entire spectrum of genders have some kind of anger suppression probably along the line. But in terms of someone who identifies as female, the suppression of anger is a real thing that has literally changed the DNA in our bodies. And this is where we carry some of that ancestral rage. It goes beyond anger when it stays suppressed for so long. And, we mentioned in the feminine masculine episode, or I think I did, about how there's a big push, or there can be a big push that if you're expressing anger and rage, it's very masculine. And the feminine rage, that's just not true. That it's just not a true statement. Because the feminine rage is rooted in the suppression of our full expression. And so I want to name that, because this generational bringing along of the rage, and unless somebody chooses to really find an expression of it that allows them to release it. And we're going to talk about, like, do we move it? What do we do? We're going to have Sara Cate lead us through some things, but somebody has to actively choose to do that. That's why I'm saying, like, it's so brave when you can recognize that, like, there's something in you that you don't love when it shows up. And it's not, again, it's not that you're bad. It's not that you're a bad person. It's not that the emotion is bad. It's telling us something. But when we can recognize that we don't enjoy the way that it makes us feel, and we would rather move forward with a different truth for ourselves, that's where, like, this work is so amazing. And if you're choosing to do that, and if you're choosing just to sit and recognize, like, okay, how does this present in my body? Like, that, it's just like something that I want to acknowledge, because there ain't many people doing it.
Right. And there, you know, this belief that somehow, anger is bad, or being upset, intensely upset, or expressively upset,
or even just the choose happiness all the time.
right? The bypass of, like, and bypassing our anger, you know, is where it does kind of start to potentially contort itself into rage.
Yeah.
Because, and then that rage goes sometimes so deep and so mismanaged, that, to Ashley's point, then it comes out in a reaction where you say something you don't want to say, or do something you don't want to do. Now, you know, I sit, and I also want to name, Ashley, to your point when you were speaking about, like, the suppression of rage specifically in women, but, like, I also want to just be really sensitive and name, like, we're white women. And for women of color and Black women in particular, like, that is, even their suppression of it is, or the mismanagement of it is so strong, because there's no allowance for it. There's no allowance for them to express fully and with as much intensity as there is there sometimes, right? Because people are held to different standards, and communities and communities of color are held to these different, you know, bullshit standards. And so I just wanted to name that too. Like, there's even in, when we're the gender conversation, right? Like, women of different colors are going to experience that very differently. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that too, and be sensitive to it, because Ashley and I are speaking from our perspective as white women who have a great, and for me, anger was a very, very suppressed thing. And so mine often came out as rage because it wasn't a pretty one. It wasn't an acceptable one. It was, it showed a degree of, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, it was embarrassing if you were angry. It was inappropriate if you were angry. And specifically as a woman. I've named before that I was raised in a Christian community. And so there was a lot of that, you know, manage, be well-behaved.
There was
be really constricted.
There's a lot of, like, you just deal with it on your own. You know, like, somebody isn't helping you, or I would see, like, my mom, right? Like, she didn't ask for the help, right? But she wasn't helped in the way that she wanted to be helped. But then it's like I'm just going to take care of it, and I'm going to deal with it later. Right. And so then all of that is like that building, because instead of just saying, hey, this is what I'm feeling right now. Like, hey, this upset me. This is how I'm feeling. And then you notice it, like, in relationship, if somebody, whether it's coworkers, and especially, you know, in the workforce, if you are not a man, if you don't agree with something, there's a whole different thought process that goes behind somebody who is not a white man speaking on that in the workforce, because of how you're going to be perceived. Are you just going to be that emotional person? Are you just going to be that difficult one? That, you know, like,
hysterical.
Like, so all of this, you know, just kind of checking in on where you're at on this spectrum of of, like we are talking about, of your privilege, because me showing my rage is going to be taken in a much better way than somebody else. I almost just spilled my smoothie.
A very green smoothie on a very white carpet. I mean, if you don't, you know I'm going to. So,
woo. But yeah,
yeah,
so,
it's going to be perceived and either, I mean, and we talk about this, like, I know that we're like in this moment of like Karens and, you know, these like really intensely overreactive spaces. And so like one could look at that and go, see, anger's not good.
Yeah.
Right. Because look at this person who is labeled as a Karen. Bless all of the Karens out there who are not Karens. Sorry about it. But that, you know, that there is this expectation that we don't ever get to be upset. And here's how I kind of start to work with this with clients. The differentiation between anger and rage is the very loud, reactive, intensely expressive form of what, if our anger was allowed to do what it needed to do, could just look as simple as, no, I don't want to. I don't like that. Right. It could be, anger could be felt in the form of just a really clear channel down through the center of your body, almost like, you know, you're just like so intensely aligned, right? Like when you felt that kind of like really strong tone in your spine, or like your shoulders are back and you're like really feeling like in your power, let's say, that anger can express like that, very simply, very directly, and very calmly. To some degree, anger can be a very, I don't like the word managed, but a very articulate, a very direct.
It just gives you a very simple fact.
Yeah.
Of
yes
what
or no.
Like what you're feeling. Like, I don't want you to actually touch me like that.
That's
like,
a no for me.
That's
anger, right? Anger is a boundaries. I always say to my clients why I find anger to be such a beneficial emotion and experience is it helps you see where you need to set a damn boundary. It helps you see where you are experiencing something in your body that's like, this isn't what I want. No.
And I think, you know, listening to Sara Cate, like even just bring that up of like, it is a simple, it can be, right? It's a simple yes or no, right? Like imagine if we were to be taught this, or maybe taught isn't, if we were to have examples of this growing up, of how, I'm going to say simply because it can be simple if you're just like willing to look at it that way, you know, but like this is totally different than what a lot of us were taught about anger.
100%.
And just how the two differences and how, like what we just talked about, the shame that would come, or like how you're viewed as difficult if you are like expressing that you're not okay with something, versus just saying, no, I don't like that. And having that be the norm of when we're growing up, whether it's in our family dynamic, at school, at work, wherever, with our friends, just how different this conversation would be. And that's, you know, one of the cool things about why we're even having these conversations is because we're hoping that we can give you a different way to look at these things. And we've said this many times, but it doesn't mean that it's easy. But
these are the uncomfortable ones.
Right.
Shame's the uncomfortable one.
Right.
Anger, rage are the uncomfortable ones.
Yeah.
And, you know, to be very clear, I don't even think, no, when rage is harmful and hurtful, it's not okay. Right. If it hurts somebody else, if it's hurting you, there's something to be done about that. However, in being a clinician who works with women specifically, and those who identify as women specifically, the rage that I do believe is important for women to feel is that of the ownership over their own bodies. Because I'm speaking, you know, just to orient to a little bit of a potential trigger warning, you know, sexual abuse and sexual assault are 90% present in my practice. And I was sitting with a client yesterday who has a history of this, and we were able to deepen. And the rage that I felt in my body in relationship to her expressing it was so profound and so strong. And it was for me to be able to sit with her in that and acknowledge it and help her feel it was imperative to her healing process. So rage in and of itself also is not necessarily something we need to cut off or shame. Right. If you have had an experience where you have not had consent over your own body or over your own experience, you might likely feel rage at given moments, or it might be really tucked way down deep in there because, again, you weren't allowed to feel it as a child, or you weren't allowed to explore it, or maybe these things have happened to you from your childhood. And in order for you to survive the life that you were in, you had to tuck it down. So there's a lot of reasons that we end up cutting our anger off, cutting our rage off. And why I think somatic work for me is so profound in that is because at some point our healing can happen when we are in a safe place to express it. And when we are in a safe place to feel it. And, you know, I, for one, as a person who walks around in a claimed female body, an owned female body, I don't want to lose sight of that rage, right? Because I want to teach my nieces, and I want to teach my nephews, and you know, to honor and respect their bodies and others, and that rage helps me do that. That rage is a catalyst for me to be a little bit of a lioness when it comes to the no's, and that you get to say when you're done, and you get to take yourself out of situations you don't want to be in, and how to protect your body and how to protect your being. Like, I don't want to lose that rage to some degree, because it does give me such inertia and motivation to have a different conversation with these littles that I'm a part of their lives, because I didn't have that. You know, and it wasn't that I was like unprotected. It wasn't that I was necessarily unsafe in my upbringing. However, I wasn't allowed to really explore what it meant for me to be so self-aware of like, I don't like that. I don't enjoy being treated this way. I don't enjoy being talked to this way. I don't enjoy being looked at like that. You know, and so that was that kind of like, oh, and then conversely, as an adult, to sit with people, even some teens. I work with some adolescents too, but to sit with these people and just to hear these stories of just like these moments where they were not allowed to say no, or they had no choice in saying no or yes. And the anger that it does bring up for me, and the rage that it can bring up for them. And then to have it felt and have it honored is such a different experience, because I will tell you, when clients leave after we've had a session like that, what I do see and what we do process through is they have a greater sense of who the fuck they are. Because they met that rage, rather than having it be a stranger to them in a safe container of therapy. They were able to like have a different conversation with it and like see that it doesn't have to be this untamed dragon that's going to destroy their life or threaten their safety. It can actually just be something that gives them information to say, not here, not now. I am not the one, not today.
I mean, like, rage in of itself in an individual is like an invitation, like she said, into knowing yourself a little bit better. Rage in a collective, in a group of people, is the catalyst for change. And that's usually how we see big movements happen, how we see large processes, not processes. What am I trying to say? You know, okay.
Processes. I think processes is just a fancy way to say it.
Yes, processes.
Oh my God. Actually, I just wanted to elevate the podcast. To make it a little more formal.
That collective rage that we have seen throughout history, and like the women's suffrage movement, all of that, like that's how change is created. And so, I mean, Sara Cate just did such an amazing job at displaying how, yes. And this, like she said, like, we're not here to say that destructive rage, when you're like destructive and like destructing
Harmful.
property, someone,
Yeah.
yourself, you know, like that's not what we're talking about, but how rage can be something that we befriend
Mhm.
and that becomes a very valuable part of us, because it is,
Mhm.
because it's, unless, you know, like what, like going back to the beginning, unless we have somebody in our life
Mhm.
show us, be an example, that whether it's generational or not,
Mhm.
that suppression is
Mhm.
gonna stay. And there has to be, like I said, like, just imagine if we all had these examples of someone in our life who could help us, because we, you know, like we come out of the womb knowing exactly how to express our emotions. We're not sorry
don't
about
manage 'em.
expressing anything. Yeah.
There's no
We like
management. of
know
that.
we're feeling something and we're going to let somebody know about it. And it is what we are then taught. It is
Yeah.
these ideals that are put on us.
Mhm.
And when we put ideals on people, we suppress them, we keep
Mhm.
them quiet so that the powers at B stay at B, right?
Mhm.
And so again, when you think about like this, a collective movement, or just this like really strong movement in yourself when you meet your own rage, and how that is then brought forward, it's honestly like, it can be such a beautiful thing, because you're again getting to know a deeper part of yourself. You're finding more of a friendship within how your internal space is held.
Mhm.
And that is something that
Mhm.
nobody can replace.
Dispute.
Like that ownership over you being a friend to your inner space is
Mhm.
like, there's nothing, nobody can take that from you. We just have to have the permission sometimes and a little bit of guidance on how to
Yeah.
fully get there.
I think the guidance is the
Yeah.
key in that, because, you know, to your point, Ashley, if you have not had those things reflected to you, if you've not had models
Mhm.
like of behavior or models of emotional management, you know, if you grew up in a household where there was all of this yelling and all of
Mhm.
this really aggressive like outbursts of energy, anger to you might feel dangerous or bad, right?
Volatile.
Or volatile.
Yeah.
Or vice versa. If you grew up in a very I call it waspy, like where it's like everything's suppressed, everything's
Mhm.
managed. You never saw your parents fight, or you never knew something was wrong, right? Like everything was always fine.
Mhm.
That also can be dangerous and feel very volatile, because things are happening in our life,
Mhm.
good things, bad things, hard things, happy things, all of it. And if you see no emotional experience around that,
Mhm.
you might feel crazy.
Yeah.
If you then have these, or like, I mean, I can't tell you how many clients apologize to me.
Yeah.
They start crying.
Mhm.
And I'm like,
Ooh, I have apologized to her many times.
she has. She does. She has. Me too. I think I'm
Yeah.
sure, I'm certain
for
I
sure.
have done that.
Yeah.
Because being highly emotional was not an acceptable thing. Oh, don't be hysterical. Don't
Mhm.
be, don't be over melodramatic.
Yeah.
Don't be dramatic.
I always like, I hear that too. I hear highly emotional and I'm like, no, I just like know my emotions. It's not
We're
even
like
high.
highly sensitive
It's just
people.
Yeah.
I'm like they're
it's just-
sensitive.
I just know my emotions. And I
Totally.
wish that you did too. No.
And yeah. And so if we never had that, and if we
Yeah.
haven't had that guidance, and that sometimes is not a fault of our caregivers. That is
Right.
not, that is
Exactly.
also what they were raised with.
Yep.
That is speaking specifically for Ashley and I, out of the generations from the Depression to the war to then how our parents were raised, there was a lot of management, and there was a lot of, well, if you can put food on the table and you have a roof over your head, you have nothing to complain about.
Yeah.
If you're not in active duty dying in World War II, you have nothing to complain about, right? Because that was kind of the rhetoric of the time, because they were experiencing that, those generations were experiencing something very different than our generations are. Now our generations have the language. We
Mhm.
have the information.
Mhm.
We recognize that a suppression of emotion likely leads to depression and anxiety and these things that feel very mismanaged in our systems.
Yeah.
So being able to start to do this work and unpack these things is really important. Why? Because it gives us a freedom to better understand ourselves and what we need, which is something we say all of the time. When we have a better understanding of who we are, then we have a better understanding of what to do to take care of that.
Yeah.
And so anger and rage, first and foremost, when we're speaking specifically about the type that needs permission to move through and needs permission to do something, right? Because I know a lot of people were speaking specifically of working with my clients. It was, if you're going to act like that, if you're going to feel like that, go to your room.
Yep.
You were isolated then.
Mhm.
And so having any sort
Mhm.
of big emotional reaction or being sensitive, there was this shame and this disconnection that came from
Mhm.
it. And so you were told you're an island if you feel anything other than what I perceive to be acceptable
Mhm.
emotions.
Yeah.
And that disconnection and that isolation is not going to help us decide that those are things we feel. And they might either become very overactive.
Yeah.
And like Ashley was kind of speaking to like more destructive behaviors. Sometimes I see that, again, a little bit of a trigger warning, but I do see that in my clients that I work with who have a self-harm history,
Mhm.
is they couldn't feel things. And so they then were able to move some of that energy through in a way that was hurtful to themselves. But it was a coping mechanism for
Mhm.
the things that they were not allowed to actually feel and were not acknowledged in feeling.
Yeah.
You know, to say, I see that you're angry, you get to be angry. And here's a boundary. Like that's what a caregiver should do, right?
Mhm.
To some degree. It's like, yeah, you get to be mad that I'm saying no, but I'm also your protector.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
you know, here's the reality. You feel your feelings. Yep, they're valid. And
Yeah.
there still has to be this boundary. But so many of us were just like, you can't, no.
Mhm.
Or our parents were neglectful or they were emotionally vacant, you know? And so then you were given probably no space to feel it for other reasons. So like,
Right.
there's a myriad of
Yeah.
ways we get to this point of suppression that inherently will not allow us to let this thing do what it needs to do.
Mhm. I think so. I just want to name really quick, when I work with clients, I work a lot with helping them demystify their vulva and their ovaries and their uterus and like this whole sacred womb space that we have within us. And I will say that the anger is often stored in this area. And as we're sitting here talking about it, I've been like just checking in on my body and I can feel it. I feel this like restriction in like my womb space, and it's very different. I've talked multiple times on this podcast about how for me, I feel anxiety like in my diaphragm. When I think of like rage and anger, there's a deeper like connection into this, like this space of where like my essence is held. And I can like feel that now as we're talking about it. And because I'm, as we're like thinking about, and like Sarah is
it's a clenching.
Like Sara Cate's talking about the women that we sit with and the things that we're with them in. And so I want to, like call your attention to this really sacred, tender space of your body and remind you that this area where it's at, it's directly affecting, I mean, kind of everything, but directly affecting your root chakra and your sacral chakra, which is your safety, your creativity, your enjoyment, your pleasure,
sensuality,
all of like expression, that those direct areas. And I'm gonna have Sara Cate walk us through an exercise in a second here, but also something that I want to kind of give as like, this may help you. On the other side of, she's going to walk us through like, how do we, like when it hits, what do we do? And on the other side of that, if there is something that you like to do with creativity, and this doesn't have to be that you're a painter, you're a writer, you're, whatever, even if it's just turning on your favorite song to give you, because this womb space like is very in touch with our creative side. And we need that in terms of like, to have this full expression of who we are. Right. And so it can be something as an in back into your body of, okay, I'm just going to turn on my favorite song and I'm just going to, my only goal is just to listen to the song. And just by doing that, or if you are a painter, you like use your fingers and paint on, like for 2 minutes, right? It doesn't have to be anything significant, but bringing attention to the areas of the body specifically that this can affect a lot. That's a way, or might prompt you, give you another idea of like, okay, they're talking about how I can still be a friend to my body. Let's figure that out. What does that look like for me? And just based off of experience and working with clients, oftentimes they will unprompted tell me like, oh, then I went and I like got in the shower and I listened to my favorite song and it just was like a really nice release. Or I went outside and went for a walk where I was just looking at the leaves changing colors or something like that. So they kind of unknowingly find their way back. But here's an example of how others' experiences might help you figure out where to go in your life.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, and I think even more, Ashley, just to, before we jump into this other thing, like to just also name, like, give yourself invitation to befriend these things is there. Yes. And before the befriending, right, it's just the meeting.
Yeah.
And knowing that like you might not like it for a long time. You might not find it a friend to you for a very, very long time. This is like you might have done a shit ton of work around your anger and you're listening to this being like, yeah, I have it. I've got it. I figured it out. And you might be like, that is, to Ashley's point, scanning your body. That is a place I don't want to go. Right. And like full permission for any of those things to be true and you to be anywhere on that spectrum of just kind of like, absolutely not to, yeah, I totally know it. And I understand who it is.
Yeah.
Because there are times, even for me still, where I do not like my anger.
Oh, for sure.
Or my rage, rather.
Yeah.
My anger, I've got a different relationship to, but my rage, like it will come out and it will come out like a growl out of my body. And if anybody is around to witness it, I have a moment of embarrassment. I have a moment of like, I couldn't be contained. I go into an old story of like, no one should see Sara like that. That is an inappropriate way for you to be in the world. You should not be this frustrated or upset right now. And I have to sit down then with that part of myself, a part that I don't particularly like, and sit next to and be like, yep, but you were feeling what you were feeling. You were that frustrated. You are feeling.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we try
intensity.
to like trick ourselves out of that. We're actually feeling that.
Like,
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah. It's
because it was explained away for us.
Exactly.
It was 100% explained away for us. So,
yeah.
So, just to explore, I love that Ashley used her womb space as this like really important area in her body that, she can feel the intensity of it and she could name that. And, that as always, we invite you into exploring your inner sensory world and saying, where does this live for me? Where does my anger sit? And it can be the simplest little exercise of just like someone sends you a shitty email or somebody, something kind of like benign, lukewarm, where you're like, oh God, I got a parking ticket, right? Maybe that's not a big deal. That would enrage me. But if that's not a massive trigger for you, just note it. Like, but it's frustrating. It's annoying. No one wants it. And so like, notice, like, is it kind of like almost like a burn from your belly up through your chest, a little bit like heartburn kind of, or is it just kind of more a snarl of like a tightening and a snarl in your jaw, like whatever that might be. And just start to pay attention to the little sensory experiences that might come along with that. Because that will be the window into some of the bigger areas that feel really unmanageable.
Yeah. Okay. So before we end, Sara Cate.
Yes, Ashley.
She, Sara Cate has given me so many of the tools and resources that I use daily.
Just always making me feel
all
the things.
You deserve to be praised. She's magic, you guys.
God.
No,
Jesus
but she has been somebody who has given me examples, who has given me has allowed me to observe what I'm feeling and then given me a way to work with it. And so I was gonna be like, I want her to, but we talked about this before she agreed to it.
I can
This isn't a surprise. But if I were to come, so I'm one of her clients right now, and I'm coming in and I'm like, here's the deal. I feel so much anger, rage, and it is fuming and it's about to burst out of the top of my head.
Yep.
And I want to know how can I begin to help myself, because I don't like how I feel when it expresses itself. Like, I want to feel differently in that time. So what the hell do I do?
What do you do? Well, and I think what you're speaking to is a really good point to start with, is like, if your anger feels chaotic for you, if it feels really uncomfortable in your body, then what this little exercise that I'm going to give you is a really great way to start to work with it. Because like we were saying, I don't even know that it's a goal to 100% fully befriend all of our emotions. Right. Like some of them might be very unsettling in our bodies.
Think about being a friend, it doesn't mean that everything is
you like it all the time.
Right?
Yeah. Someone's hurting you.
Whatever I'm trying to say.
Processes.
Anyways.
So like your anger might be something that in the impulse of it or in the inception of it feels really uncomfortable. And so this is a really cool way to start to like slow it down and kind of integrate it a little bit. So then you can really feel then you can look at what the root cause of it is or the emotion of it is. And then you set the boundary, right? So this is kind of, we might not always like the way it first presents or shows up. So Ashley and I were kind of talking, and I was just like kind of naming what, through my own, work that I've done with clients and myself, what I have found, generally speaking, is that anger is something that needs mobility. It needs movement. If we think about people, like if someone gets in a physical fight, right, there's this need to move, to act, to engage with our bodies. So anger and rage tend to present like Ashley was talking, sometimes it's destructive behavior, right? Like there's this physicality to anger that is very much felt, like, whereas like, let's say, feeling doom, that's just like a bottom dropping out of your stomach. There's movement to it, but there's not necessarily, sometimes it's immobilizing. Sometimes we can't act, but with anger, oftentimes we do see, not all the time, but we do see this, like, I have to yell, I have to scream, I have to move, I have to work out really hard, or I have one client in specific, like you were saying, when it feels really mismanaged, she used to like punch walls, like, unfortunately, and that was really dangerous for her and anybody around her, really, to experience. And so and I have actually used this exercise with her, and she has found it to be supportive of this. So when we think about this kinetic kind of like movement of energy, right? Like, this like, setting a boundary, even like saying no, right? Like has this kind of like action to it. And so when we're feeling angry, before we maybe want to react towards somebody or towards something, what we can do is give our body permission to start to kind of do what it needs to do to complete this anger response. Two ways we can do that. We can do that in creating traction against our own hands. So drawing your hands together in the center of your body, almost like in, in prayer position, you would call it, or like in the yoga world, it was like, prayer hands at the center of your chest, right? But you create this traction, right? The right pushes into the left pushes into the right. And you start to feel, and if you're watching this, you can see my muscles starting to shake, right? And that I feel heat through my arms. I feel heat in my face by doing that. I actually feel like some of the tension in my jaw get a little bit tighter But then as I release, my jaw softens, my arms soften, and I feel that kind of residual energy. It's almost like a coolness. A wave kind of moves down the arm. So that's a way to kind of dissipate some of that energy. And even like if you want to kind of move that in even a little bit more, which I actually like to do this with people who have maybe had their boundaries crossed, who have not been able to consent to certain things in their life. We do this thing called, we do the same kind of traction, but you push against a wall, right? And so you can do it a number of ways. But you place your hands on the wall, you place your feet where you can really kind of dig your legs and your feet into the ground as an anchor. And then you can either just push all of your energy into the wall, or you can push and move essentially the wall away from you as your body moves backwards. Either one can work. It's just dependent on what your body needs. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to move this energy in a direction where it gets to go somewhere and it gets to do something that it needs to do, essentially. And we might not ever have a cognitive awareness or like an understanding of why we need to do that, but just even the action of being able to like move that heat and move that tension and move that, maybe even you were like talking kind of about constriction through, rather than having to then have this more, what maybe feels more mismanaged or uncomfortable of like having to like fight or punch or yell. I mean, yelling into a pillow is great, right? Like those kinds of things that's again, moving it through, but pushing the wall actually creates a full body sensory experience because you're creating tension in your legs, your chest, your core. All of these different places are really giving this jaw, sometimes it's like the face. And oftentimes what I've found with my clients is like this release. And sometimes it's a very emotional release. Sometimes anger is a precursor for something really deeply sad for us. So, I do recommend having support in doing this, a practitioner, maybe come into your therapist's office and say, hey, I heard about this thing. I really want to do it, but I want some support while I do it to process whatever might come through afterwards. Or maybe it's a friend or a partner, but somebody that you feel safe with to just be like, hey, I need to move some of this through. But for some of my clients, this is now something that they do pretty consistently with their anger. Now because again, they've become more familiar with it, that they can just utilize this action-oriented exercise to allow the sensory experience of it to kind of dissipate. And then they get to be with what information is actually sitting there and take care of themselves.
Totally. I love that so much because it's also something, if you're wanting to do some of this more in private, right? Like even if you're out in public, you can go into the bathroom and do, like you can find a private space to do this. And so I think that that's really helpful because I think that's a barrier for, or it can be a barrier for a lot of people, is not wanting to like express this out in the open. And, or if you're just sitting, at your desk and you're doing the prayer hand one, like there's not a whole lot of explanation that is going to come from that. Oh, sorry. And it is giving you your power back. You become in control of it again. And so I just think that was so great to share. So as you practice though, like Sara Cate said, support. I mean, like I said, Sara Cate has given me the tools and resources that I use daily. And or if I need a new one, she's there for me. But this life, this human experience is not meant to be done alone. No. And it is in relationship, it's in connection with people who are supporting you through these things that you can really find some deeper healing magic, whatever you want to call it.
I love it.
Okay.
Be gentle with yourselves best you can as you meet your anger, if you choose to do some of this work and explore that. Because this isn't, like we said, we haven't had the guides necessarily. We haven't potentially had the roadmaps to our own emotional experience. And so when we first meet these difficult ones, it can feel really uncomfortable, so just going gently, taking care with your heart. And as always, reach out.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay, we'll see you next time.